White cop lies about a black woman in court, not knowing she's a high-ranking Navy SEAL officer. You underestimated me, Bez Officer Simmons. But the truth always finds a way. What could make a courtroom freeze with shock? A police officer accuses a black woman of resisting arrest and assault. His story sounds convincing until she takes the stand and turns the case upside down. Who is she? Why does her testimony leave the officer, or the jury, and even the judge stunned? This is the story of how one lie was exposed and a fight for justice turned into a fight for truth. The early morning sun shone through the heavy curtains of the courtroom and casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. Although the room was striking in its grandeur, it had a stifling atmosphere. Rows of wooden benches were filled with curious townspeople, reporters recording every detail, and a few people with expressions of anxious anticipation. Among them sat Monica Jackson. At first glance, she looked calm, but inside a storm was raging. Her dark brown skin shimmered slightly under the artificial light, and her neatly braided tresses touched her shoulders softly. She sat upright, her posture impeccable, as if an invisible thread supported her back. Her hands were calmly folded in front of her. Her clothes, a starched white blouse and strict black pants, had been chosen deliberately. She wanted to look dignified, to inspire respect, but most importantly, not to give away her true nature. There was a sharpness of mind and attentiveness in her gaze that would have eluded the superficial observer. Those who really looked could see something unusual in her, a quiet strength, uncharacteristic of a woman accused of violence. The bailiff announced the start of the hearing, and all eyes turned to the front of the room, where Judge Howard Grayson, an elderly white man with thinning gray hair, entered. He looked tired, too many years, too many trials. But this case seemed to have awakened a spark of interest in him. Maybe it was Officer Bradley Simmons, Biraud, sitting at the plaintiff's table with a smug smile. Or maybe it was the hype the reporters had already created. State v. Monica Jackson, the bailiff's voice boomed under the high ceiling. Monica stood up, her movements precise, honed. She turned to the judge. There was whispering in the hall, people trying to get a better look at her. Officer Simmons leaned back in his chair, intense, an expression of confidence and even amusement sliding across his face. He wore a perfectly pressed uniform and exuded the usual arrogance of a man accustomed to impunity. Monica's attorney, Benjamin Carter, was nervously flipping through his notes. Young, fresh out of law school, he looked unsure. He looked to her for support, but Monica didn't look at him. Her attention was on the judge. Your Honor, Carter began, his voice trembling slightly. We're ready to proceed. The judge nodded. Officer Simmons, please take the stand to testify. Simmons rose, his movements too measured, too calculated, as if he were playing a role before an invisible audience. He shook off his epaulets, adjusted his uniform, and looked at Monica. His smirk was subtle, almost invisible, but too obvious for her. He considered himself the hunter. She his prey. He sat down and took the oath. Monica watched intently. She noticed the subtle twitching of his fingers, the way he shifted slightly in his chair. The slightest change in his posture, all this she memorized, analyzed, formed a picture. He was nervous, which meant she already had the advantage. On the evening in question, Simmons began in a confident voice. I arrived on a disturbance call on the east side of town. I saw the defendant, Miss Jackson, standing outside a closed store. Muffled exclamations rang through the courtroom. Vagrancy is too convenient a charge, especially against black people. When I asked her to identify herself and explain what she was doing, he continued, she was immediately aggressive. She refused to show me her ID or raised her voice. And then he paused, as if gathering his strength. She attacked me. She hit me in the chest and then tried to grab my service weapon. Sighs rang out in the courtroom. Monica did not move. Her face remained impassive. Simmons displayed an expression of pain. I had no choice but to hold her. In the back of the hall, someone muttered quietly, "Lying." Heads turned. The judge banged his gavel. "Thank you, Officer Simmons," he said in an even tone. "You may return to your seat." Carter stood up. He looked agitated. "Your Honor, before we continue, I ask the court to save for cross-examination. Mr. Carter, the judge interrupted. "Let's continue." Monica exhaled. She was barely holding back. Leaning toward Carter, she said quietly, "Stay calm. Focus on the facts." He nodded, though he looked unsure. Miss Jackson / the judge's voice was stern / skeptical. "It's your turn to testify." Monica stood up. She slowly smoothed out her blouse and stepped toward the podium. There was a tense silence in the hall. Everyone was waiting. She took her seat / adjusted the microphone. The prosecutor, Chalk, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, stared at her. "Ms. Jackson," he began. "Can you explain your actions that night?" Monica leaned forward slightly. "Of course. But first I need to make one thing clear." Her voice was steady and confident. "The officer's account isn't just inaccurate. It's deliberately false." There was a deafening silence in the courtroom. Monica Jackson waited a moment, letting the silence envelop the courtroom before continuing. The prosecutor opened his mouth, preparing to object, but her confidence made him hesitate. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, signaling for the questioning to continue. As Monica began to tell her version of events, the tension in the room rose. Each listener held their breath and absorbed her every word, realizing that this was no ordinary defendant standing before them. No one knew that the wheel of justice had already begun its motion, and Officer Simmons' carefully constructed lies were beginning to crack at the seams. Monica sat in the witness stand, her posture impeccable and her expression unperturbed. She placed her hands on the wooden railing and paused for a moment before speaking. The silence in the hall became almost palpable. Everyone held their breath waiting for her words. "That evening," she began, glancing around the room, "I was on my way home from visiting a friend. I stopped at the corner of Magnolia and 5th Street to look up the route on my phone." She paused briefly, allowing the information to settle in the minds of the jury. "And that's when Officer Simmons approached me," she continued. The prosecutor stepped forward, preparing to catch her in a contradiction. "Are you saying it was completely without merit?" Monica tilted her head to the side, her gaze remaining calm. "Not exactly. I was standing on the sidewalk, which to my knowledge is not a crime. The officer came up to me, pointed a flashlight in my face, and asked me what I was doing here in a tone that was hardly friendly." "And how did you respond?" The prosecutor tried to sound open-minded, but his voice betrayed skepticism. "I said I was checking the itinerary," Monica replied flatly. Then he asked for identification. I asked if I had violated anything. The prosecutor seized on that detail. So you questioned his authority? I questioned his intentions? Monica corrected him calmly. I wasn't interfering with traffic. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't disturbing the peace. I just wanted to understand why he was demanding my passport. A low rumble of indignation swept through the room. Judge Grayson lightly banged his gavel on the table. Silence in the courtroom, Monica continued, her tone unchanged. When I asked him to explain the reason for the inspection, he raised his voice and accused me of insubordination. I said I didn't want any trouble, but before I could add anything, he grabbed my arm. Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a crushing silence. The prosecutor raised his eyebrows, clearly considering how to turn this to his advantage. Are you saying that the officer used force without cause? Monica nodded. Yes. And when I said I didn't consent to the touching, he squeezed my hand harder. Then he said, She paused, looking into the faces of the jury. Women like you have to learn to listen. Loud sighs rippled through the room. This time the judge banged the gavel harder. I will not tolerate shouting, he warned. The prosecutor smiled strainedly. Ms. Jackson, this is a serious charge. Do you have evidence? Monica stared at him. No. Because the officer's chest camera tapusia as coincidentally stopped working. Right, Officer Simmons? All eyes turned to Simmons. He squirmed in his seat, his smug grin evaporating and replaced by a tense expression. The prosecutor coughed. Let's focus on the facts. Miss Jackson, point. What happened next? Monica folded her hands, keeping her voice calm. I told him he was violating my rights and asked him to let me go. He refused. Instead, he charged me with resisting arrest, even though I did not even move. When I tried to break free, he threw me on the hood of the patrol car. There were whispers in the room, and the faces of the audience expressed a mixture of anger and shock. Even the judge looked a little stunned. After that, the prosecutor tried to regain the initiative. He handcuffed me and announced that I was under arrest for assaulting an officer Mobakin. Monica paused, then added, even though I didn't even touch him. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair. You're a strong woman, Satellite, Ms. Jackson, point. Perhaps the officer felt threatened? Monica didn't flinch. I'm no stronger than a trained police officer. Let's be clear. I didn't resist until he started exceeding his authority. The prosecutor opened his mouth, about to object. But Monica continued before he could utter a word. And yes, I also did not reach for his weapon as he claims. That's a lie to justify his violence. The hall froze. Simmons fidgeted in his chair again, his confidence now looking ostentatious. The prosecutor's face darkened. Are you saying that Officer Simmons, an honored member of the police force, fabricated this incident? Monica smiled weakly. The barely perceptible change in her expression gave her words added weight. The truth always finds a way to manifest itself. You will see it soon enough. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Jackson, are you suggesting you have evidence? Monica's attorney had Benjamin Carter stood up quickly. Your Honor, the defense intends to present additional evidence at trial. The prosecutor snorted. If you had anything substantial, you would have already presented it to the court. Monica looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, the truth takes time. But when it comes out, it cannot be doubted. The judge studied her with his gaze for a few seconds, then nodded. All right. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning/9 a.m. As the judge's gavel came down, the hall filled with whispers. Monica rose calmly, walked past Simmons, who avoided her gaze, and headed for her attorney. "Are you sure?" Carter whispered, doubt audible in his voice. Monica put a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Trust me, Ben. Tomorrow." The truth would speak louder than any words Simmons could say. As Monica walked out of the courtroom, the muffled hum of the crowd, a mixture of curiosity and speculation, echoed behind her. Outside, the setting sun was coloring the city in warm golden tones. She stood still on the courthouse steps for a moment, gazing out at the horizon. The battle wasn't over yet, but she was ready. She was always ready. The people slowly dispersed, leaving behind a tension that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Monica stood at the edge of the steps, her silhouette standing out against the scarlet sunset. The whisper of voices, the rustle of footsteps, it was all somewhere far away. Her thoughts were directed inward, toward what was to come. "Monica," came a quiet but insistent voice nearby. She turned her head. Standing next to her was Benjamin Carter, her lawyer. He was clutching his briefcase tightly in his hands, as if it contained not just a set of legal documents, but her sentence itself. His face was full of doubt and worry. "We need to talk," he added. She bowed her head slightly, her gaze hard but calm. "What are you thinking about, Ben?" He took a deep breath, his breath dissolving in the cool evening air. "You're hiding something. The judge knows it. The prosecutor senses it. And Simmons, he's getting nervous. Whatever trump card you have, I need to know about it before the hearing tomorrow." A slight smile touched Monica's lips. "You'll know everything when the time comes." "It's not enough," he said with pressure, lowering his voice. "I'm your lawyer. If we're going to win, I have to be prepared for what you're going to do." She studied him carefully, as if weighing his words, his resolve. Then she nodded slowly. "Come to my house tonight. I'll tell you everything." He blinked, surprised at the sudden pliability. "Really? Really?" She answered firmly. But not here. Monica's house was on the edge of town, surrounded by tall oaks, their branches swaying in the night breeze. The dim lantern light illuminated the porch, casting long shadows on the gravel driveway. Benjamin slowly stepped out of the car, looking around. After the chaos of the courtroom, the silence of the place seemed almost ominous. He knocked on the door. It opened almost instantly, as if Monica had been waiting for him. She was dressed simply, a navy blue sweatshirt and black leggings, a sharp contrast to her collected look in court. Her hair was pulled back, her expression impenetrable. "Come in," she said briefly. Benjamin crossed the threshold, looking around. The living room was neat and modest, almost devoid of personal details. But his gaze lingered on a couple of items. A photograph of a young Monica in a naval uniform, her hand on the shoulder of an older man in the same uniform. A folded American flag in a glass case on the mantelpiece. A bookcase filled with tomes on leadership, strategy, and history. "Do you live alone?" he asked, more to fill a pause than out of curiosity. "For now," she replied, pointing to the couch. "Will you have anything to drink?" "No," he sat down, setting his briefcase at his feet. "I want answers, Monica. No distractions." She grinned faintly, assessing his resolve. Okay. She walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a leather folder. Worn, but neatly maintained. The edges were a little frayed, but the pages inside were in perfect order. She placed it on the table in front of him and sat down across from him. Benjamin looked at the folder, but didn't touch it. What is it? My military service, she said calmly. Everything you need to know about me. He hesitated. You're just giving me this? You're my lawyer, she said. You need to know who you're defending. He opened the folder slowly, running his fingers over the papers. Inside were impeccably organized documents. Discharge papers, awards, training certificates. The further he read, the wider his eyes grew. Wait, he muttered, turning the pages faster. You were Lieutenant Commander. Retired. She finished for him. He stared at her, his mouth ajar in surprise. You were a Navy SEAL? That period? That changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before? Because it's not just about me. Her voice was firm. It's about what Simmons represents. This isn't just my fight, Ben. It's a fight for the truth. To expose the system that allows people like him to get away with it. Benjamin ran his hand over his face, his thoughts racing. The A. Dot will be furious when he finds out about this. And Simmons? He won't be able to take it. Monica's expression darkened. Simmons won't break. People like him only shrink harder when they're backed into a corner. That's why we have to be smarter. More strategic. Benjamin nodded, now realizing the magnitude of what was happening. Do you think he's figured it out yet? Not yet, she answered. But he senses something wrong. You saw the way he looked at me today. He knows he's missing something. And it's eating him up inside. Benjamin closed the folder and leaned back on the couch, letting out a long exhale. So, what's the plan? Monica stood up, her posture unyielding even in her simple house attire. She walked over to the fireplace, took the folded flag in her hands, or turned it over, running her fingers over the fabric thoughtfully. Then looked directly at it. Tomorrow in court we will show the truth. But we'll do more than that. We won't just expose Simmons's lies. We'll show how the system covers up for people like him. And how are we going to do that? He asked, leaning forward. Monica clutched the flag, her eyes flashing with quiet, unwavering determination. We're going to make them see me. Not as a defendant, but as a woman who has spent 20 years defending the very freedoms this man has tried to take from me. Monica leaned forward, her gaze full of determination. There will be a fight tomorrow, Ben said softly. She returned the flag to the mantelpiece, her hand lingering on it for a moment. Then she turned around, and fire flashed in her eyes. I've been fighting all my life. Ben. Tomorrow is just another battle. The next morning, the courthouse loomed in the pale gray light of dawn, its imposing facade casting long shadows on the crowd gathered on the steps. News of the trial had spread overnight, and now the whispers had grown into thunderous discussions. In the courtroom, Sopraurs, the atmosphere was heating up, everyone waiting for the trial to continue. Monica sat at the defense table, her expression impenetrable but attentive. Her navy blue jacket and neatly ironed white shirt gave her a collected and confident look. Benjamin Carter flipped through his notes, his nervousness betrayed only by the slight tapping of his pen on the desk. Ready? He asked quietly, casting a quick glance at her. Monica turned her head slightly, her voice sounding steady. I've been ready for years. Ben, let's show them the truth. The clang of Judge Grayson's gavel filled the hall. Court is now open. We continue with the case of State versus Montica Jackson. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp facial features, rose first. His voice sounded confident. Your Honor, we intend to corroborate Officer Simmons's testimony and present additional evidence to support the charges. Montica remained unfazed. She could feel the stares directed at her, but maintained an unwavering calm. The prosecutor called Simmons to the stand. He adjusted his tie, his movements slower than usual, as if under the weight of intense scrutiny. Officer Simmons, the prosecutor began, his voice firm but restrained. Remind the court of the events leading up to the defendant's arrest. Simmons cleared his throat. As I stated earlier, I noticed the defendant's suspicious behavior outside the closed store. She refused to produce identification and was aggressive when attempted to be questioned. Do you confirm that she behaved aggressively? Clarified the prosecutor. I do, Simmons replied, his gaze sliding over Montica for a moment. The prosecutor nodded in satisfaction. Thank you, officer. I have no further questions. Benjamin rose slowly, his expression remaining impenetrable. He slowly approached the podium, his footsteps sounding in the tense silence. Officer Simmons, he began, his voice soft, but there was an underlying sharpness to it. You claim that my client tried to grab your weapon. Is that correct? Yes, Simmons replied, his posture stiffening. But you also say that your chest camera wasn't working at the time, Benjamin continued. That's a coincidence, isn't it? Simmons clenched his jaw. It was a technical malfunction. Of course, Benjamin agreed, nodding leisurely. How many years have you been on the force? 10 years. In those 10 years, how often has your camera malfunctioned during arrests? Simmons hesitated. Not often, but this one time it did. Benjamin turned to the court. That's a curious coincidence, especially since we have a videotape of the incident taken by a witness. The audience gasped. The gallery leaned forward, as if hoping to see the evidence immediately. Judge Grayson rattled his gavel. Mr. Carter, if you have evidence, present it to the court. Benjamin pulled out a flash drive. Your Honor, the defense is presenting a video taken by an eyewitness during the arrest. The D.A. jumped up. Your Honor, this is a violation of procedure. The evidence should have been presented in advance. Sit down, the judge interrupted him. Turn on the tape. The screen came to life and there was a tense silence in the hall. The image was jagged, taken through a car window, but the sound was clear. Don't make this harder on yourself. Simmons's voice rang out. His hand clutched Montiqui's arm. Her voice sounded clear and calm. I'm not resisting. Let me go. In the video, Simmons pushes her against a patrol car, then utters words that gave everyone in the audience goosebumps. Women like you have no right to ask questions. The courtroom exploded with outraged cheers. Judge Grayson struck the gavel again. Silence in the courtroom. When the judge called a recess, the crowd slowly left the room, but the tension remained as before the storm. Montica sat at the defense table. Her calm was unbreakable. Benjamin sank into the chair next to her. You were right, he said quietly. The truth always comes out. Montica looked up at him, her gaze full of determination. This isn't over, Ben. Tomorrow, we're not just going to expose Simmons. We're going to show how the system that allowed him to get this far works. Benjamin paced the room, his hands moving nervously and his lips moving silently as if he were trying to process what was happening. "It's a bomb," he finally said, stopping in front of Monica. That video destroyed his testimony. Monica folded her hands on the table, her gaze remaining steadfast. "It's just a crack in the wall, Ben. And cracks alone don't bring walls down. We need more dot." Benjamin exhaled sharply and leaned on the table. "What's the next step? We have the record. We have your military career. We can bury Simmons right now." She looked at him, a shadow of a smile flickering in her eyes. "It's not just about destroying Simmons. We have to uncover the truth. If we rush, we'll lose control of the situation. It's important to choose the right moment." Before Benjamin could reply, the bailiff's voice carried through the room. "The meeting will resume in 5 minutes." Monica stood up, adjusting her jacket. "Hang in there, Ben. It's time." As soon as the judge entered the room and the session resumed, all eyes turned to Simmons. The confident grin with which he had started the day was gone. Now his face was tense and his gaze was darting. In the back row, his colleagues, the same ones who had previously been silently cheering him on, glanced over with growing alarm. Judge Grayson's voice interrupted the tense silence. "Mr. Carter, do you have any further evidence?" Benjamin rose slowly, his movements measured and confident. "Yes, Your Honor." The defense calls to the witness stand the defendant, Monica Jackson. Once again, a buzz of curiosity swept through the room. Monica rose, her steps measured, her gaze unwavering. She took the witness stand and sat up straight as a soldier at a drill. "Miss Jackson," Benjamin began, his voice steady but tense. "You've heard the charges against you. Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to take possession of his weapon. Are they true?" "No," Monica answered firmly, her voice echoing through the room. Benjamin nodded. "Then tell us what happened that night, in your own words." Monica inhaled slowly, looked around the room, and then looked at Benjamin again. "That night I was on my way home from visiting a friend. I stopped to check my phone and get directions. That's when Officer Simmons approached me. He asked me what I was doing here. I answered dot. When he asked for ID, I asked why. I wasn't breaking the law, and I wanted to understand his reasons." "And how did he respond?" Benjamin asked. Monica's jaw tensed. "He stated that I was not cooperating. When I tried to explain my position, he grabbed my arm and refused to let me go, despite my words that I had done nothing illegal." Benjamin stepped closer to the jury, his voice a little louder. "Did you threaten him?" "No," Monica answered confidently. "I told him to let go of my hand. When I tried to get free, he pushed me onto the hood of the patrol car and handcuffed me. After that, he accused me of trying to take possession of his gun." "That's a lie." There was whispering in the hall again, but Monica wasn't finished. "His actions had nothing to do with enforcing the law, and Dembao," she continued, her voice still firm but tense. "It was an act of control, a show of power over a man he considered weak." Benjamin was silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. "Ms. Jackson," he spoke again, "the prosecution has portrayed you as an ordinary civilian who suddenly became aggressive. But is there anything in your story that the court needs to know about?" Monica met his gaze, and for the first time her impeccably calm expression changed. There was steel in it. Determination point. Anger point. "Yes." she answered, her voice as firm as a clap of thunder. I'm Lieutenant Commander Monica Jackson. Retired. Former Navy SEAL. There were gasps of amazement in the courtroom. Judge Grayson froze for a moment, keeping his gavel down. Simmons went pale. His jaw tensed, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair. Benjamin stepped forward, his voice resounding with renewed vigor. As a SEAL, you were trained to handle stressful situations. Did you apply those skills during the incident with Officer Simmons? Yes, Monica answered without hesitation. I used them to stay calm, minimize the threat, and protect myself without resorting to violence. And did you ever try to harm Officer Simmons or take possession of his weapon? Benjamin asked. No, she said firmly. My training has taught me to assess threats and react accordingly. Simmons was not a threat to my life. He was a threat to my dignity, and I wasn't going to let him take him. The hall exploded with screams. The judge banged his gavel on the table several times. Silence! I demand silence! When the noise died down, Benjamin turned to the jury, his voice shaking with emotion. Gentlemen of the jury, you have heard Officer Simmons's side of the story. Now you have heard the truth from a woman who has dedicated her life to the defense of this country. The question you need to ask yourselves is simple. Who do you believe? The prosecutor did not look up, his face pale. Simmons sat motionless, his fingers still gripping the armrests. Monica returned to her seat, her back straight, her head held high. She leaned slightly toward Benjamin and said quietly, Now let's see how long it takes for this wall to collapse. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Officer Bradley Simmons sat at the plaintiff's table, his face pale and his forehead covered with sweat. The confidence with which he had entered the room was gone, leaving behind only trembling hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. His colleagues, who had hitherto formed a silent wall of support in the back row, began to glance around, doubting whether they would see justice done today. The judge, whose normally unruffled face showed signs of fatigue, looked around the room before turning to Simmons's attorney. Mr. Avery, does the prosecution intend to continue the questioning? Or do you need time to rethink your strategy? He asked. Prosecutor Richard Avery rose slowly to his feet, his impeccably polished demeanor beginning to crack. He adjusted his tie, as if tightening a noose, and took a step toward the witness stand. Your Honor, he began. We intend to call Officer Simmons back in for questioning to clarify some inconsistencies. The judge nodded. Proceed. Simmons rose slowly. His movements seemed stiff, as if under the weight of mounting pressure. He avoided Monica's gaze, who watched him closely with icy calm. When he finally sat down at the witness stand, his hands shook as he adjusted the microphone, a gesture that didn't escape the jury's attention. Avery moved closer, trying to portray a confident smile. Officer Simmons, you've heard the defendant's testimony and her allegations about your behavior. Do you have anything to say in response? Simmons cleared his throat, his voice shaky but still resolute. Yes. Her version of events is exaggerated. I acted within the scope of my duties. Avery nodded encouragingly. And how do you explain the videotape presented to the court? Simmons hesitated, his gaze traveling to the jury, then back to Avery. The video doesn't show everything. It's incomplete. It doesn't capture the context of her behavior at that moment. And what was that context? Avery pressed. She was defiant, Simmons's voice rose as if he'd found a lifeline. She refused to cooperate, challenged my authority. I had to act decisively to keep order. Monica watched him with an expression that almost read regret. Her hands remained calmly folded on the table. Benjamin leaned toward her and whispered, "He's losing control." Monica nodded faintly, not taking her eyes off of what was happening. Avery continued, his voice becoming strained. "So you're confirming that the defendant attempted to take possession of your weapon?" "Yes," Simmons answered instantly, but his voice was weaker. She made a sudden movement toward my holster. I had to protect myself. Benjamin stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, permission to cross-examine." "Permission granted." The judge nodded. Benjamin walked leisurely to the witness stand, his steps sounding confident, but not threatening. He stopped a few feet away from Simmons and paused, letting silence fill the room. "Officer Simmons." He began, his voice calm but with a sense of steel in it. "You have repeatedly alleged that my client attempted to take possession of your weapon. Is that correct?" "Yes." Simmons clenched his jaw. "And yet," Benjamin continued, "you have no evidence of this? No fingerprints on the holster? No corroboration from other witnesses?" "Just your word? I know what I saw," Simmons said stubbornly. Benjamin nodded, as if thinking about it. "You know what you saw," he repeated, then looked at the jury. "But the court saw something else, a videotape that contradicts your story. Footage of my client being calm and non-aggressive until you start using force." "That video is taken out of context," Simmons tried to object, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. Benjamin tilted his head to the side. "Okay, let's talk about context. You are a man who approached a law-abiding citizen, demanded identification without explanation, and then, when asked why, used force. And after all of that, you lied under oath in an attempt to cover up your actions." The prosecutor jumped up from his seat. "Objection. Overruled," the judge replied calmly. "Continue, Mr. Dot." "Carter." Benjamin turned to Simmons again, his voice becoming almost icy. "Officer Simmons, you accused a veteran Navy SEAL, a woman who served her country honorably, of being a threat to you. Aren't you ashamed to realize that the person you were trying to intimidate faced dangers you never even dreamed of?" Simmons shuddered, his confidence finally melting away. He opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words. "Your Honor, I have no further questions," Benjamin announced and turned around, heading for his desk. Simmons returned to his seat, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the floor. His co-workers didn't look at him. Their faith in his innocence was crumbling. Monica watched him for a few seconds, then leaned over to Benjamin and said quietly, "The wall is starting to crack." Benjamin smiled weakly. "Let's finish it off." Contrasting with Simmons' frustration, her quiet presence became more and more imposing. There was a power in that silence that filled the room more effectively than any words. Benjamin Carter ran through his notes one last time, clenching his jaw in determination. This was more than a case. This was retribution. Judge Grahn coughed, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Carter," he said, a note of caution in his voice. "The defense may proceed." Benjamin stood up, buttoning his jacket, and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense has one last piece of evidence that will dispel any doubt as to what really happened the night of my client's arrest. There were whispers in the room, Borne, the audience craning their necks, trying to see what would happen next. Simmons visibly tensed, his white knuckles gripping the edge of the table. The prosecutor, Xiao Richard Avery, tensed visibly, his former confidence replaced by wariness. Monica, on the other hand, remained motionless, her gaze calm and focused. Benjamin pulled a folder from his briefcase and raised it so that the jury could see it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice firm and confident. "Over the past few days, you've heard two versions of the same story. Officer Simmons wants you to believe that my client, a woman with no criminal record and a career dedicated to serving her country, suddenly and gratuitously became violent. But the truth is far simpler and far more disturbing." He opened a folder and pulled out some documents. "This," he said, lifting the first page, "is Officer Simmons' personnel file. And it reveals a pattern of behavior that calls into question his credibility. Or rather, completely destroys it." The prosecutor rose abruptly. "Your Honor, I object. This is irrelevant." Judge Grayson raised his hand to order. "Overruled. Proceeds Mr. Carter." Benjamin nodded and turned to the jury again. "Officer Simmons has been the subject of many complaints over the years of his service: abuse of authority, racial bias, inappropriate behavior. These complaints have either been ignored or covered up by the department. But today, they surfaced." He handed copies of the documents to the jurors, and they began to scrutinize them. The courtroom was growing noisy. Even the expression on the judge's face grew tense as he ran his eyes over the papers. Benjamin paused, letting the words sink into the minds of those present, and then turned to Monica. Now it was time for her to speak her truth. Monica stood up, her movements crisp and confident. She approached the court with her head held high. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Monica Jackson, Apu," she began, her voice firm and determined. "For 20 years I served in the United States Navy. I was a Navy SEAL. I've been to places most people can't even imagine, faced dangers no one knows about. And despite all that, I've always held myself to the highest standards of honor and discipline." She circled the jury with her gaze, her words weighing more than could be expressed. "I have faced enemies on the battlefield, but I never thought I would one day face them in my homeland. I was no threat that night. I didn't break the law. I just existed. And for someone like me, that sometimes seems like a crime in itself." There was a sepulchral silence in the hall. Those who had been whispering were now silently absorbing every word. Officer Simmons didn't see me as a person. He saw me as an object, an opportunity to assert his power and control. But he didn't see the most important thing: my strength, my will, and my refusal to remain silent. She turned to Simmons, her gaze penetrating. "You underestimated me, Officer Simmons. But more importantly, you underestimated the truth. And the truth always comes out." Simmons looked away, his face reddened. The jury kept their eyes on Monica, their expressions shifting from skepticism to admiration to anger. Anger not at her, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Monica turned to the judge again. "Your Honor, I fought for this country. I fought for justice. And I stand here today not only for myself, but for everyone who has ever suffered at the hands of those who swore to protect us." The hall erupted in applause. Judge Grayson banged his gavel on the table several times, calling for order. "Silence," he thundered, though his eyes showed respect. "Mr. Carter, continue." Benjamin put his hand on Monica's shoulder. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Jackson. The defense has no further questions. As Monica returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the room changed. The jury looked at her with respect. Simmons, on the other hand, seemed to shrink in his chair, his self-confidence crumbling. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair and looked at the prosecutor. We'll proceed to closing arguments. I advise both sides to choose their words carefully. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Tension hung in the air. Prosecutor Richard Avery stood up, nervously adjusted his tie, and approached the jury. His voice sounded restrained, but lacked the usual confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, this is a complicated case. Prosecutor Avery continued. Do not forget that the defendant not only questioned the order, but resisted arrest, provoking an escalation of the situation. His voice became firmer. I urge you to be guided by facts, not emotions or loud statements. Thank you. The hall held its breath as he returned to his seat. Now it was Benjamin Carter's turn. He stood up, leisurely adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and stepped toward the jury with serene confidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice calm but firm. This is not a difficult case. It is painfully obvious. My client, Lieutenant Commander Monica Jackson, a decorated naval officer and hero of her country, and has been prejudiced or abused and slandered by a man who abuses his authority. He paused, then gestured toward Monica, who sat with a straight back, her hands resting on the table. Monica Jackson did not resist arrest. She did not threaten Officer Simmons. She only asked a question. Just one question. Why? And for that, she was thrown on the hood of a car, handcuffed and humiliated. Benjamin's voice grew stronger, filling the room. This case isn't just about her. It's about responsibility. About the fact that anyone who wears a badge and takes an oath to protect people has to meet the highest standards of honor. Because if they violate those standards, the whole system collapses. He stepped closer to the jury, lowering his voice. Today is your chance to show that the law is more than just words. That justice is a principle that cannot be ignored. I believe you will make the right decision. He returned to his seat, and the room fell once again into tense silence. Judge Grayson began to read the instructions to the jury, after which they were sent to deliberate. The hours dragged on like days. Monica sat in the courtroom hallway with her hands clasped together. Benjamin paced the room, his forehead furrowed. The voices of reporters and gawkers could be heard all around, but Monica didn't notice anything. Do you think they will see the truth? Benjamin finally asked, breaking the silence. Monica looked up at him, her eyes calm. They don't need to see it, Ben. They need to feel it. The truth always finds a way to come out. Benjamin nodded, though the tension never left him. But before they could say anything else, the bailiff appeared in the doorway. The jury had reached a verdict. The hall was full as everyone took their seats again. Tension was in the air. Monica stood next to Benjamin, her face impenetrable. Simmons sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the jury, but his posture betrayed anxiety. The jury forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind but serious eyes, rose as the judge addressed her. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she answered firmly. State it. The woman unfolded the paper and began to read. In the case of State versus, Monica Jackson, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges. Emotions instantly erupted in the audience. There were sighs of relief, muffled exclamations of joy. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Monica exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in a long time. Benjamin squeezed her shoulder, his face spreading into a smile. The forewoman continued. Furthermore, we, the jury, strongly recommend an investigation into Officer Simmons's actions. The judge nodded, his gaze growing colder. The court will take it under advisement. Officer Simmons, you are strongly advised to get an attorney. This case is far from over. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Cameras flashed, all microphones reached forward. But Monica stood confident, all her voice firm. This is not just a victory for me. This is a victory for justice, a victory for everyone who has been silenced. I didn't fight for this alone, and I won't stop fighting for others. Benjamin stood beside me, pride in his eyes. The crowd erupted in applause as Monica turned and walked away, leaving the camera flashes behind her. A few months later, Officer Simmons was fired from the police force and prosecuted for perjury and malfeasance. His former colleagues distanced themselves, and the investigation uncovered more abuse. Monica returned to her regular life, but her name became a symbol of resilience and justice. She spoke at conferences, inspiring others to fight for the truth. Although her war on the battlefield was long over, she knew that her real battle for justice was just beginning. Because for her, truth is not just a goal, it's a way of life. And on this day, the truth prevailed.